Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other when they need it most. In the harsh 1800s frontier, a weathered cowboy rode the endless trails alone, carrying the weight of difficult past. Day after day, a small wolf pup began following his horse. At first, he tried to chase it away, fearing the danger it might bring. But the little creature kept returning, its eyes holding a sadness that seemed to mirror his own broken spirit. When the cowboy finally followed the pup back into the remote canyons, what he discovered would shatter his hardened heart. The pup's entire family had been slaughtered by hunters, leaving the baby wolf completely alone. What would this broken man choose to do next? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Wyoming valleys like whispered prayers, and Jacob Morrison knew this would be another day of solitude. He had grown accustomed to the silence that stretched between him and the horizon, broken only by the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves against the hardened earth. At 45, Jake had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much, yet his blue eyes still held a gentleness that contradicted the harsh lines etched by sun and sorrow. His worn leather journal lay tucked against his chest, pressed between his shirt and vest, a constant companion that held the sketches and scattered thoughts of a man trying to make sense of a world that had taken everything from him. The journal's pages were filled with drawings of landscapes that reminded him of home, fragments of half-remembered prayers his mother used to whisper, and the careful observations of a man who had learned to find beauty in the smallest details. When the larger picture had become too painful to bear, Thunder, his bay gelding, snorted softly as they crested a ridge overlooking the Powder River Valley. The horse had been with Jake for 7 years now, purchased with his last army pay in Cheyenne when he decided the uniform no longer fit the man he had become. Thunder understood Jake's moods without need for words, sensing when his rider needed to stop and sketch the way morning light painted the red rock formations, or when grief pressed too heavily and they needed to ride hard until the ache in Jake's chest matched the burn in his lungs. The year was 1873, and the frontier was still raw and unforgiving. Jake had been riding these territories for nearly a decade, working cattle drives, taking temporary jobs at ranches, always moving when the weight of other people's expectations grew too heavy. He had learned that staying in one place too long meant answering questions about family, about plans for the future, about why a man of his obvious intelligence and gentle nature chose to live like a drifter. The truth was written in careful script across the pages of his journal, though he had never shared those words with another soul. Sarah Morrison, beloved wife, taken by consumption in the winter of '63. Little Thomas Morrison, age 6, lost to the same fever that ravaged their Tennessee town just months after his mother passed. The boy had fought bravely, just as Sarah had, but Jake had been helpless to save either of them. He had watched the light fade from their eyes while his own heart turned to stone. After their burial, he had enlisted in the Union Army, not out of political conviction, but from a desperate need to lose himself in something larger than his grief. The war had given him purpose for a time, and his natural leadership abilities had earned him respect among the men. But when the fighting ended and other soldiers spoke eagerly of returning to wives and children, Jake found himself with nowhere to go and no one waiting for his return. He had tried settling in Kansas for a spell, working a small farm near Dodge City. The soil was good, and he had a talent for coaxing life from the earth that reminded him of working his father's fields as a boy. But the silence of the farmhouse at night had been deafening, filled with echoes of laughter that would never sound again. One morning he had simply saddled Thunder, left the deed on the kitchen table, and ridden west toward a horizon that promised nothing except distance from his memories. The territories suited him. Here, a man's past was his own business, and the work was honest, if dangerous. He had learned to read the weather in the way clouds gathered over distant peaks, to sense the mood of cattle by the way they moved across grassland, to find water in country that looked bone dry to inexperienced eyes. His journal captured these lessons in sketches and notes, the way certain plants indicated underground streams, the subtle signs that warned of coming storms, the migration patterns of the wildlife that shared these endless spaces. Jake had developed a routine that kept him centered in this vast emptiness. Each morning, he would read a passage from the small Bible his mother had pressed into his hands when he left home as a young man, though the words often felt hollow in his mouth. He would check his gear with military precision, ensuring his rifle was clean and his supplies properly secured. Then came the ritual of opening his journal to a fresh page, dating it carefully and making note of the weather, his location, and any observations worth preserving. The sketches had started as mere documentation, maps of promising grazing areas, drawings of landmarks that would help him navigate the territory. But gradually, they had evolved into something more personal. He found himself capturing the curve of a hawk's wing against the morning sky, the way light fell across a meadow dotted with wildflowers, the dignified bearing of an old buffalo bull standing sentinel over his herd. The act of drawing forced him to truly see the world around him, and in that seeing he began to rediscover fragments of the wonder he had thought lost forever. His days followed the rhythm of the land itself. He would rise before dawn, brew coffee over a small fire, and spend the first hour of daylight in contemplation with his journal open across his knees. The writing came harder than the sketching. Words had always seemed inadequate to capture the complexity of his emotions, but he persisted, believing somehow that getting the thoughts down on paper might lighten the burden of carrying them. In his heart, as the sun climbed higher, he would break camp and ride, always moving but never with urgent purpose. He had learned to trust Thunder's instincts about safe passages through difficult terrain, and the horse seemed to understand that their journey was about the traveling itself rather than reaching any particular destination. They might follow a ridge for miles just to see what lay on the other side, or spend an afternoon beside a mountain lake while Jake sketched the way aspen leaves caught the light. The solitude had become both his companion and his prison. He cherished the freedom from having to explain himself, the ability to stop when something caught his attention without considering another person's schedule or expectations. But there were moments, usually in the deep silence before dawn, when the loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight. Those were the times he would reach for his journal and write letters to Sarah and Thomas that would never be sent, telling them about the beautiful places he had seen, the small adventures of his solitary life, the ways he still carried their love with him across these empty miles. The country itself had become his church, more sacred to him than any building crafted by human hands. In the cathedral silence of a pine forest, in the ancient wisdom written in rock formations older than memory, in the patient endurance of plants and animals that thrived in conditions that would break softer spirits, Jake found echoes of the divine presence his mother had tried to teach him to recognize. His faith had been shattered by loss, but something deeper than belief, a kind of wordless reverence for the mystery of existence, had taken root in the ruins. This morning was like countless others, unremarkable except for the particular quality of light that made the distant mountains appear to float above the horizon like purple dreams. Jake opened his journal to record the date, May 15th, 1873, and paused with his pencil poised above the page. Something felt different about this day, though he could not have said what. Perhaps it was simply the restlessness that came with spring, the sense that the world was stirring to new life while he remained suspended in the amber of his routine. He sketched the view from their vantage point, taking care to capture the way morning shadows pooled in the valley below. Thunder shifted beneath him. Ears pricked forward, as if sensing something Jake could not yet perceive. The horse had always been more alert to subtle changes in their environment, a trait that had served them well in country where danger could appear without warning. Jake closed the journal and tucked it safely away, then reached down to pat Thunder's neck affectionately. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together as they always had. Two solitary souls, finding companionship in shared silence and the endless promise of the trail that stretched beyond the next hill. It was near midday when Jake first noticed the small grey shape trailing them at a distance. At first glance, he mistook it for a coyote. They were common enough in this territory, and usually smart enough to keep their distance from horses and men. But something about the creature's gait caught his attention, the way it moved with a different rhythm than the skulking trot of a scavenger. Thunder's ears flicked backward, and Jake felt the horse's muscles tense slightly beneath him. The gelding had excellent instincts about potential threats, but his reaction seemed more curious than alarmed. Jake reined to a halt and turned in, his saddle shading his eyes against the afternoon sun to get a better look at their follower. The animal stopped when they did, maintaining its distance of perhaps 50 yards. Now Jake could see it more clearly. Definitely a wolf, but young, possibly still a pup by the size of it. Its coat was a mixture of grey and silver, with distinctive dark markings around the ears and muzzle. What struck him most was the way it sat perfectly still, watching them with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus. Jake reached instinctively for the wooden cross pendant that hung beneath his shirt, a habit he had carried since childhood. Whenever something unsettled him, the smooth wood, worn soft by decades of handling, had been carved by his father for his mother when they were courting. She had worn it every day of her life, and it had been one of the few personal items Jake had taken from the house after her death. Though his faith had grown complicated over the years, the cross remained a tangible connection to the love and certainty he had once known. "Get on out of here," Jake called, his voice echoing across the open ground. He waved his hat in the air, the motion that usually sent wildlife scattering for cover. The young wolf tilted its head, but otherwise didn't move. If anything, it seemed to settle more comfortably into its watching position. Jake tried a sharper approach, spurring Thunder forward a few steps while making loud whooping sounds that should have terrified any sensible wild animal. The pup simply stood and trotted backward to maintain the same distance, then sat down again. Its expression, if such a word could be applied to a wolf, seemed almost patient, as if it were willing to wait all day for Jake to finish his display. "Stubborn little fellow," Jake muttered, though he found himself oddly impressed by the pup's composure. In his years on the frontier, he had encountered plenty of wolves, and they were typically either aggressive or evasive. This one seemed to fall into neither category, displaying instead a kind of determined persistence that reminded him uncomfortably of his son Thomas, who had possessed the same quality of quiet stubbornness when he had set his mind on something. Jake decided to test the pup's resolve. He urged Thunder into a steady trot, heading toward a grove of cottonwoods where they might find shade and water. Behind them, the young wolf followed at the same measured distance, matching their pace with an ease that suggested it could keep up this routine indefinitely. As they rode, Jake found himself stealing glances backward more frequently than he cared to admit. The pup moved with a fluid grace despite its youth, and there was something in its bearing that spoke of intelligence beyond its years. Most young animals displayed a certain frantic energy, but this one seemed possessed of an almost adult composure. They reached the cottonwoods as the afternoon heat was beginning to press down in earnest. A small creek wound through the grove, and Jake dismounted to let Thunder drink while he refilled his water bottles. The wolf pup appeared at the edge of the clearing, settling into the shade of a large boulder where it could observe without intruding. Jake pulled out his journal, thinking that sketching might help him make sense of this unusual encounter. As his pencil moved across the page, capturing the pup's alert posture and distinctive markings, he found himself studying the animal more carefully than he had intended. There was something in its eyes, a kind of deep sadness that seemed far too mature for such a young creature. The cross pendant felt warm against his chest as he worked, and he found himself remembering his mother's gentle voice telling him stories about St. Francis and his ability to speak with animals. She had possessed an uncommon gift with creatures herself, able to calm the most skittish horse or coax a wild bird to eat from her hand. "All of God's children understand love," she used to say, "even when they can't speak the same words." Jake had inherited some of that gift, though he had rarely acknowledged it. Horses trusted him instinctively, and even cattle seemed to respond to his presence with less anxiety than they showed other men. But he had always attributed it to patience and quiet movements rather than anything mystical. Now, watching the young wolf watch him with such unwavering attention, he wondered if there might be more to his mother's beliefs than he had credited. As the afternoon wore on, Jake made several more attempts to discourage his follower. He rode in circles, backtracked along their route, even tried hiding behind a stand of rocks to see if the pup would lose interest and move on. Each time, the wolf simply adjusted its position and resumed its patient surveillance. It never approached closer than 40 or 50 yards, never showed any aggression, but neither would it be dissuaded from its apparent mission of accompaniment. By evening, Jake had to admit a grudging respect for the creature's determination. As he made camp beside the creek, he found himself speaking aloud to the wolf, though it remained at its customary distance. "I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish," he said, as he gathered deadwood for a fire. "I've got nothing to offer you, and keeping company with humans isn't likely to do you any favors in the long run." The pup's ears perked forward at the sound of his voice, and for a moment Jake could have sworn it was considering his words with serious attention. Then it settled down with its head on its paws, clearly prepared to spend the night keeping watch from its chosen vantage point. Jake built his fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, the familiar routine helping to center his thoughts. As darkness settled over the camp, he pulled out his journal again and tried to capture his impressions of the day. The wooden cross seemed to grow warmer as he wrote, and he found himself thinking of all the lonely creatures in the world, animals and humans alike, who sought connection across the barriers that seemed to separate all living things. The young wolf never moved from its position throughout the night, maintaining its vigil with a dedication that both troubled and touched the solitary cowboy. In its unwavering presence, Jake recognized something of his own persistent loneliness, and for the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps he wasn't the only soul in this vast territory who understood what it meant to be completely alone. When he finally banked the fire and rolled into his blankets, Jake found himself listening for the sound of the pup moving away into the darkness. But the soft breathing from across the clearing continued steady and peaceful until he drifted off to sleep, the wooden cross cradled in his palm like a talisman against the uncertainties that tomorrow might bring. Jake woke to find the wolf pup in exactly the same position where he had seen it last, alert, patient, and utterly devoted to its mysterious vigil. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and it occurred to him that the young wolf seemed to have become one with the shadows themselves. So naturally did it blend with the dappled light and darkness beneath the trees. "Shadow," Jake said aloud, the name emerging from his lips before he had consciously decided upon it. The pup's ears pricked forward at the sound, and something in its posture suggested it approved of the designation. "Well, Shadow, if you're determined to follow me, I suppose I ought to know what to call you." As Jake went through his morning routine, checking Thunder's hooves, organizing his gear, brewing coffee over the rekindled fire, he found himself acutely aware of Shadow's presence. The pup never moved from its chosen distance, but Jake could feel those intelligent eyes tracking his every movement. It was both comforting and unsettling to have such dedicated attention after so many months of complete solitude. When Jake sat down with his coffee and hardtack, he noticed Shadow's nose working the air, clearly picking up the scents of his meager breakfast. The pup was thin, not starving, but definitely leaner than a young wolf should be. Jake felt a familiar tug in his chest, the same protective instinct that had once driven him to smuggle extra rations to hungry soldiers during the war. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a strip of dried beef, holding it up so Shadow could see it clearly. "You hungry, boy?" The pup's entire body seemed to vibrate with interest, though it made no move to approach. Jake tossed the jerky to a spot roughly halfway between them, then settled back to see what would happen. Shadow approached the offered food with extreme caution, never taking his eyes off Jake as he crept forward step by careful step. When he finally reached the jerky, he sniffed it thoroughly before picking it up and retreating to his original position to eat. The whole process took nearly 10 minutes, but Jake found himself oddly fascinated by the pup's combination of hunger and wariness. As he watched Shadow eat, Jake's hand drifted automatically to the inner pocket of his vest, where he kept the small tin-type photograph that was his most precious possession. The image was faded now, the faces becoming indistinct around the edges, but he could still make out Sarah's gentle smile and Thomas's eager expression as they posed for the traveling photographer who had come through their town in the spring of 1862. Sarah had been 6 months pregnant in the photograph, though she had insisted the photographer arrange her shawl to disguise her condition. "I want this picture to last," she had said, laughing at her own vanity. "When we're old and grey, I don't want to be remembered only as someone who was always expecting." Jake had teased her about it at the time, but now he treasured the image precisely because it captured her as he had always seen her. Beautiful, dignified, and full of the quiet strength that had first drawn him to her. Thomas stood beside his mother in the photograph, one small hand resting on her arm in unconscious mimicry of Jake's own protective gesture. Even at 6 years old, the boy had possessed an old soul, always asking thoughtful questions about the world around him and listening to the answers with the same serious attention that Shadow now gave to Jake's every movement. The memory of Thomas's endless curiosity about animals struck him with particular force as he watched the young wolf finish the dried beef with delicate, almost dainty bites. His son had possessed an uncanny ability to communicate with creatures. Barn cats would seek him out for attention, and even the most nervous horses would calm at his approach. Sarah used to joke that Thomas had inherited his father's way with animals, but magnified it tenfold. "He would have loved you," Jake said softly, and Shadow's head tilted as if trying to parse the emotion in his voice. The pup's ears were remarkably expressive, Jake noticed, flicking forward when he spoke directly to him, swiveling to track distant sounds, communicating a range of responses that seemed almost conversational. As they prepared to break camp, Jake found himself modifying his routine to accommodate his new companion. He moved more slowly, speaking in low, reassuring tones as he went about his tasks. Shadow seemed to appreciate the narration, his tail giving small, cautious wags when Jake explained what he was doing and why. "Thunder here is getting a bit jealous of all the attention you're receiving," Jake said as he saddled the horse. Thunder snorted and tossed his head as if in agreement, though his ears remained relaxed. "Don't worry, old friend. There's room enough for both of you in this lonely life of mine." The words surprised him with their truth. For the first time in months, Jake found himself looking forward to the day ahead, rather than simply enduring it. Shadow's presence had introduced an element of unpredictability into his carefully ordered existence, and he discovered that the change was not unwelcome. As they rode out of the cottonwood grove, Shadow fell into his established pattern of following, at a distance. But Jake noticed subtle changes in the pup's behavior. He seemed more relaxed, less rigidly alert, and occasionally he would trot ahead to investigate something interesting before returning to his position. It was as if the simple act of sharing food had established some basic level of trust between them. Jake pulled out his journal as they paused to rest at midday, sketching Shadow from memory and trying to capture the unique quality of intelligence. He saw in the pup's eyes. As he worked, he found himself writing notes about wolf behavior, documenting the subtle ways Shadow communicated his moods and intentions. The scientific observation gave structure to emotions that were becoming increasingly complicated. The photograph of Sarah and Thomas seemed to burn against his chest as he wrote. For so long, He had guarded his heart against any new attachments, believing that love was too dangerous a luxury for a man who had already lost everything that mattered. But Shadow's patient devotion was wearing away at defenses Jake had thought impregnable, forcing him to consider the possibility that perhaps some connections were worth the risk of eventual loss. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the trail, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Tonight, he would try moving the dried beef a little closer to his fire, not close enough to make Shadow uncomfortable, but near enough to suggest that the distance between them might not need to be quite so vast. It was a small step, but for a man who had spent years running from the possibility of caring about anything again, it felt as significant as crossing a continent. 3 days into their strange companionship, Jake discovered that Shadow possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand human intention. It began when Jake absent-mindedly whistled a low 2-note call while checking Thunder's girth, the same sound his father had taught him for calling in the milk cows back in Tennessee. Shadow's head snapped up with such sharp attention that Jake tried the whistle again, deliberately this time. The young wolf rose immediately and took several steps closer before stopping, as if some invisible boundary had been reached. His tail gave a tentative wag, and his whole body language spoke of eagerness barely held in check. Jake felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same pleasure he had once taken in teaching Thomas to whistle back the songs of meadowlarks and wood thrushes. "So you understand that, do you?" Jake said, his voice carrying the warm approval he had once reserved for his son's small triumphs. He whistled again, this time adding a 3rd note that made the call more melodic. Shadow's response was immediate and dramatic. He trotted forward another 10 feet, closer than he had ever ventured, and sat with perfect precision, as if he had been trained from birth to respond to such signals. That evening, as Jake made camp beside a small spring, he pulled out the silver harmonica that had been his constant companion since Sarah's death. The instrument had belonged to her father, a gentleman who had worked the riverboats along the Mississippi and filled his evenings with melancholy melodies that seemed to capture all the longing of a life spent in constant motion. Sarah had given Jake the harmonica during their courtship, laughing as she admitted she had no musical talent herself, but hoped he might learn to play the songs her father had loved. Jake had indeed learned, finding in the music a way to express emotions that words could never adequately capture. During the war, his harmonica had provided comfort to homesick soldiers around countless campfires. In the years since, it had become his evening ritual, a way of marking the transition from the practical concerns of daylight to the deeper contemplations that came with darkness. As the first haunting notes drifted across the campsite, Jake noticed Shadow's reaction with growing amazement. The young wolf moved closer than he had ever dared, drawn by the music as if it were some elemental force he could not resist. His eyes never left Jake's face as the melody unfolded, and occasionally he would tilt his head in a gesture so human-like. It was almost unsettling. Jake found himself playing songs he had not attempted in years, lullabies Sarah had hummed while working in their garden, folk tunes his mother had sung while churning butter, the complex melodies his father had whistled. While teaching young Jake to read weather patterns in cloud formations and wind shifts, each song seemed to bring Shadow incrementally closer until the pup was lying just at the edge of the firelight, close enough that Jake could see the individual guard hairs that gave his coat its distinctive silver sheen. "My father would have said you have music in your soul," Jake told Shadow as he lowered the harmonica. He believed that animals could hear things in music that humans missed. The truth beneath the notes, he called it. The memory of his father came flooding back with unexpected clarity. James Morrison had been a quiet man, more comfortable with animals than people, who had taught Jake to observe the world with a naturalist's patience and attention to detail. He had possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that bordered on mystical, able to predict when storms were coming. By watching the way horses held their ears, or when it was safe to approach a seemingly fierce bull by reading the subtle signals in its posture and breathing. Animals don't lie, his father had often said. They can't pretend to be something they're not, which makes them more honest than most humans. If you want to understand what's really happening in the world, watch how the animals behave. Now, studying Shadow's expressive face in the flickering firelight, Jake found himself applying his father's lessons with renewed interest. The young wolf's behavior was becoming increasingly complex, displaying elements that seemed to bridge the gap between wild instinct and learned response. When Jake whistled certain sequences, Shadow would cock his head and then attempt to vocalize. In return, not howling, but a softer sound that seemed deliberately modulated to harmonize with the human's call. Over the following days, Jake began systematically teaching Shadow a vocabulary of whistle signals. A sharp, ascending note meant, "Come closer." A descending trill meant, "Stay back." A long, steady tone indicated, "All clear," while a rapid series of short blasts served as a warning. Shadow learned with astonishing speed, responding to new combinations of notes as if he intuited their meaning rather than simply memorizing through repetition. But it was the wolf's natural instincts that truly impressed Jake. Shadow could detect the presence of other animals long before Jake or Thunder noticed anything unusual. His behavior would shift subtly, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring, body tensing in preparation for either fight or flight depending on what his senses told him about the approaching creature. When a mountain lion passed within half a mile of their camp one night, Shadow's low growl and positioning between the potential threat and Jake's bedroll demonstrated protective instincts that no amount of training could have instilled. Yet for all his wildness, Shadow was developing behaviors that seemed almost domesticated. He would wait patiently while Jake prepared meals, never begging but clearly hoping for scraps. He learned to move quietly around the campsite, avoiding the gear and supplies with careful precision. Most remarkably, he began to anticipate Jake's needs, bringing small sticks when he saw Jake gathering firewood, positioning himself as a windbreak when storms threatened, even alerting Jake to Thunder's loose hobbles one morning with a series of urgent vocalizations that were clearly meant to convey specific information. Jake found himself talking to Shadow more and more as the days passed, narrating his thoughts and observations as if the wolf could understand every word. Perhaps he could. Shadow's responses were becoming increasingly sophisticated, as if he were learning to interpret not just the words, but the emotions behind them. "You're caught between two worlds, aren't you?" Jake said one evening as Shadow settled into his customary position just outside the fire's reach. "Too wild to be tame, but too attached to be truly free. I understand that feeling better than you might think." The harmonica felt warm in his hands as he raised it to his lips, and the melody that emerged was one he had never played before, an improvised song that seemed to capture both the loneliness of the frontier and the fragile hope that came with unexpected companionship. Shadow's eyes reflected the firelight as he listened, and in those amber depths, Jake thought he glimpsed something that looked very much like understanding. The decision came to Jake gradually, like morning light creeping across the canyon walls. For nearly a week, he'd been watching Shadow's behavior more carefully, noting the way the young wolf would occasionally stop and stare toward the northwest, with an expression of such profound longing that it made Jake's chest ache. There was something unfinished in Shadow's attachment to him, a restless quality that suggested the pup was still tied to whatever tragedy had left him orphaned and alone. Jake's Winchester rifle lay across his saddle, its polished walnut stock, warm from the morning sun. The weapon had been his companion since his army days, a tool he had hoped never to use again for anything more violent than hunting game for sustenance. But something in Shadow's haunted eyes reminded him that the world could be cruel in ways that demanded justice, and justice sometimes required the willingness to use force against those who preyed upon the innocent. "We need to know what happened." "On to your family," Jake said as they made camp on the evening of their 7th day together. Shadow had grown comfortable enough to lie within 10 feet of the fire, close enough that Jake could see the subtle changes in his expression as he spoke. "You'll never be at peace until we face whatever it was that took them from you." Shadow's ears pricked forward at the serious tone, and he rose to a sitting position with the alert bearing he always displayed when Jake's voice carried particular gravity. The pup seemed to understand that significant decisions were being made, and his entire focus was fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that was both touching and slightly unnerving. The next morning, Jake made a careful study of the terrain. Maps he carried in his saddlebags, correlating them with his observations of Shadow's behavior patterns. The young wolf consistently showed the strongest emotional reactions when they traveled northwest, toward the complex of canyons and mesas that formed the broken country beyond the Powder River. That landscape would provide ideal territory for a wolf pack. Plenty of game, water sources, and natural shelter in the form of caves and hidden valleys. "If we're going to do this, we do it right," Jake told Thunder as he secured the rifle more carefully in its scabbard. The horse had served him faithfully through dangerous country before, and Jake trusted the gelding's instincts almost as much as he trusted his own. Thunder's ears swiveled backward as if listening to Jake's plans, and he seemed to sense that they were embarking on something more serious than their usual meandering journey across the territory. The canyon country proved even more rugged than Jake had anticipated. Ancient geological forces had carved the landscape into a maze of narrow passages and hidden valleys, some so deep and shadowed that they retained an almost primeval silence. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly agitated as they penetrated deeper into the maze, and his vocalizations became more frequent and urgent. On the afternoon of their second day in the canyons, Shadow suddenly bolted ahead without any prompting. From Jake's whistle commands, the pup had never disobeyed a signal before, and his departure was so abrupt that Jake felt a stab of genuine panic. But Thunder seemed to understand what was happening and followed Shadow's path without needing direction, picking his way carefully down a steep switchback trail that led into one of the deeper valleys. Jake smelled the death before he saw it, the sweet, cloying scent that no amount of wind and weather could entirely erase. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle, though he knew the danger here was long past. Thunder's nostrils flared and his step became more cautious, but the well-trained horse continued forward with the trust of an animal that knew his rider would not lead them into unnecessary peril. The massacre site was hidden in a small meadow, at the valley's heart, surrounded by towering red rock walls that would have made it invisible from any distance. Jake dismounted slowly, his stomach already churning from what his eyes were beginning to process. The scattered bones told a story of systematic slaughter that had nothing to do with nature's own cycles of predator and prey. 7 adult wolves lay where they had fallen, their skeletons picked clean by scavengers, but still arranged in the defensive formation they had tried to maintain in their final moments. A large male, clearly the pack's alpha, had died in the center, surrounded by what appeared to be his mate and their offspring. The positioning suggested they had made a last stand to protect something, and Jake realized with a sick certainty that Shadow must have been what they died defending. The evidence of human involvement was unmistakable and damning. Spent rifle. Cartridges glinted in the afternoon sun, far too many for a clean kill or even a desperate fight for survival. This had been an execution, methodical and complete. The hunters had taken only the prime pelts, leaving the rest to rot, a waste that spoke of profit motive rather than need or even sport. Jake sank to his knees beside the remains of what had once been Shadow's mother, and felt something break, open inside his chest. The tears came without warning, carrying with them not just grief for these slaughtered innocents, but all the accumulated sorrow of his own losses. Sarah's face swam before his eyes, then Thomas's, and finally the faces of countless soldiers he had seen cut down in their prime by men who killed for causes they barely understood. Shadow approached the remains of his family with a dignity that was heartbreaking to witness. He moved from skeleton to skeleton, touching each one gently with his nose in what could only be described as a ritual of remembrance and farewell. His own vocalizations were soft and mournful, a keening sound that seemed to carry across the canyon walls like a prayer for the dead. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that sighed through the rocks. "I'm so damned sorry this happened to you." The Winchester felt heavier in his hands as he stood and began gathering stones for cairns. Shadow watched with solemn attention as Jake built small monuments over each set of remains, working with the same methodical care he had once used to tend the graves of fallen comrades. The physical labor helped contain emotions that threatened to overwhelm him, and the simple act of honoring the dead felt like the only meaningful response to such senseless violence. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. They would track down the men responsible for this slaughter, not for revenge. He had seen enough of what revenge could do to a man's soul, but for justice. Shadow deserved to know that his family's deaths had been acknowledged and answered. The rifle across his lap was no longer just a tool for hunting game. It had become an instrument of justice, and Jake Morrison was prepared to use it to ensure that some debts to innocence were finally paid in full. Jake had been aware of the watcher for nearly an hour before the old Lakota emerged from the shadows between the canyon walls. It was Shadow who had first alerted him, the young wolf's ears pricking forward and his body tensing with attention rather than alarm, suggesting the presence of someone who posed no immediate threat. When the elderly man finally stepped into view, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to read both land and people with equal precision, Jake felt no surprise at his appearance. "You honor the dead well, Wasiku," the old man said, using the Lakota term for white man, but without any particular hostility. His English was accented but clear, and his eyes held the kind of depth that came from witnessing both great beauty and terrible sorrow over many decades. "The four-legged ones do not always find such respect from your people." Jake rose slowly from where he had been sitting beside the largest of the stone cairns, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. "They deserved better than they got," he replied simply. "Someone needed to acknowledge that." The elder nodded approvingly and approached with the unhurried pace of someone who had long ago learned that the important conversations could not be rushed. Shadow watched his approach with interest, but no fear, and Jake took that as a positive sign. The young wolf had proven to be an excellent judge of character. "I am called Wise Eagle," the old man said, settling onto a flat rock with the ease of someone comfortable in any landscape. "I knew this pack. They were good neighbors, keeping the balance as the Creator intended." His weathered hands gestured toward the cairns Jake had built. "The young one there," he indicated Shadow. "He carries their spirits now. That is why he came to you." Jake felt something stir in his chest at those words, a recognition that reached deeper than rational understanding. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand in the white man's greeting. Wise Eagle clasped it briefly, his grip still strong despite his obvious age. "The men who did this evil thing," Wise Eagle continued without preamble, "they came through our territory 3 suns past. 5 of them, led by one with hair like winter wheat and eyes that hold no light. They spoke of hunting wolves for bounty money, but their hearts were dark with something deeper than profit." Jake's jaw tightened. "Did you see which way they went?" Wise Eagle studied him carefully before answering. "You seek justice, not revenge. I can see this in how you built the stones, in how you speak to the young wolf with gentleness. But justice can become revenge very quickly when the blood runs hot. Are you certain of your path?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, and Jake found himself considering it more seriously than he had expected. In the depths of his grief and anger over the massacre, he had assumed his motivations were clear and righteous. But Wise Eagle's gentle challenge forced him to examine the darkness that had taken root in his heart since discovering the slaughter. "I want them to answer for what they did," Jake said finally. "But not because killing them will bring Shadow's family back. Because letting them continue means more innocents will die, and I can't live with that on my conscience." Wise Eagle reached into a leather pouch that hung from his belt and withdrew a small object that he pressed into Jake's palm. It was a medicine bag, no bigger than a child's fist, made from soft deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the fading light. "My grandmother made this when I was your age," the elder said. "Inside are herbs and stones that carry the power to heal both body and spirit. But the real medicine is not in the bag itself. It is in remembering that all living things are connected, that the pain of one becomes the pain of all, and that healing must come from understanding rather than from the spilling of blood." Jake turned the medicine bag over in his hands, feeling the weight of both the physical object and the responsibility it represented. The beadwork was exquisite, each tiny glass bead placed with the precision that came from both skill and reverence. As he held it, he felt a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over the rage that had been building in his chest. Shadow approached and sniffed the medicine bag with obvious interest, his tail giving small, tentative wags. Wise Eagle chuckled at the wolf's reaction. "He knows what it is," the old man said. "The four-legged ones understand medicine in ways we have forgotten. They know that true strength comes from harmony, not from conquest." As if to confirm Wise Eagle's words, Shadow moved closer to Jake than he had ever dared before, finally crossing the invisible boundary that had separated them since their first meeting. The young wolf pressed against Jake's leg with gentle but unmistakable affection, and Jake felt his heart swell with emotions he had thought buried forever. "The bond between you grows stronger," Wise Eagle observed with satisfaction. "This is as it should be. He has chosen you to carry his pack's memory forward, and you have chosen to accept that honor. But remember, you do not seek these hunters alone. The young wolf carries the spirits of his family, and they will guide you toward the right path if you learn to listen with more than your ears." As night fell over the canyon, Wise Eagle shared his knowledge of the hunting party's movements and habits. The leader, whom he described as a man named Brennan, was known to local tribes as someone who killed without necessity or respect for natural law. The group had been working their way north, leaving a trail of slaughter that included not just wolves, but any wildlife that might bring profit in the territorial markets. "They make camp carelessly," Wise Eagle said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had tracked many different kinds of prey over the years. "They believe their rifles make them safe from all consequences, but they do not understand that some debts cannot be paid with bullets alone." When Wise Eagle finally prepared to leave, he placed a gentle hand on Shadow's head in blessing. The young wolf submitted to the touch with complete trust, as if he recognized in the elder's presence something sacred and worthy of reverence. "Carry the medicine bag close to your heart," Wise Eagle told Jake as he gathered his few possessions. "When the time comes to face these men, let it remind you that you fight not for revenge, but for the balance that keeps all life sacred. The spirits of the slaughtered pack will be with you, but so will the spirits of healing and wisdom." As the Aida, old Lakota disappeared back into the canyon shadows, as silently as he had appeared, Jake felt the medicine bag's weight against his chest, where he had hung it beside his mother's wooden cross. For the first time since discovering the massacre site, his path forward seemed clear, not just as a mission of justice, but as a sacred responsibility to honor the connection between all living things that Shadow had helped him rediscover. Jake found the knife 3 days after leaving the burial grounds, half buried in the sandy soil beside a cold campfire where the hunters had stopped to butcher their kills. The blade caught the morning sunlight as he dismounted to investigate the abandoned site, and something about its distinctive shape made his blood run cold, even before he fully processed what he was seeing. The knife was a Bowie blade, nearly 10 inches long with a curved guard and a handle carved from elk antler. But it was the specific pattern of stains on the steel, dark brown patches that no amount of cleaning had been able to remove completely, that made Jake's hands shake as he lifted it from the dirt. He had seen this exact knife before, had watched its owner use it to gut and skin his victims with the methodical precision of a man who took genuine pleasure in his work. "No," Jake whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it. Shadow immediately moved closer, sensing his distress with the heightened awareness that had become second nature between them. The young wolf pressed against Jake's leg, offering what comfort he could, while Jake stared at the weapon that had haunted his nightmares for over a decade. The memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. The night raid on their Tennessee farm in the autumn of 1862, when Confederate irregulars had swept through the valley, burning homes and murdering anyone suspected of Union sympathies. Jake had been away with his unit, fighting in Kentucky, while Sarah and Thomas remained behind to tend the farm. He had returned 3 days later to find his house reduced to smoking ruins and his family's bodies in the front yard. The leader of the raiders had been a tall, pale-haired man who called himself Colonel Brennan, though Jake had later learned the rank was self-appointed, and the man was nothing more than a glorified bushwhacker who used the chaos of war as cover for his own savage nature. Witnesses from neighboring farms had described how Brennan had taken particular pleasure in terrorizing women and children, using his distinctive knife not just as a weapon, but as an instrument of torture designed to extract information about hidden valuables or Union sympathizers in the area. Jake had tracked the raiders for weeks after finding his family's bodies, driven by a grief so consuming that he had barely slept or eaten during the pursuit. But Brennan and his men had vanished into the Kentucky mountains like smoke, and eventually, Jake's commanding officer had ordered him to abandon the hunt and return to his duties. The war had ended without Jake ever finding the man who had destroyed his world. And over time, he had convinced himself that justice might have been served by someone else's hand, or that Brennan might have died in the countless skirmishes that marked the war's final chaotic months. But now, holding the blood-stained knife that had killed his wife and son, Jake knew that justice had been deferred rather than denied. Colt Brennan, for Wise Eagle had mentioned the name, though Jake had been too focused on the Wolf massacre to make the connection until now, was still alive, still killing innocents for pleasure and profit. The man who had carved the light, from Thomas's eyes and silenced Sarah's gentle laughter forever, was somewhere in these mountains, treating the slaughter of Shadow's family as just another day's work. Shadow whimpered softly and pawed at Jake's leg, clearly distressed by the waves of emotion rolling off his human companion. Jake forced himself to breathe deeply, to set the knife aside and focus on the young wolf's concerned face. The medicine bag Wise Eagle had given him seemed to grow warm against his chest, and he found himself remembering the elder's words about fighting for balance rather than revenge. "It's him, Shadow," Jake said, his voice barely steady enough to form the words. "The man who killed your family is the same one who killed mine. After all these years, after all these miles, we've found each other through you. The coincidence was too profound to be mere chance." Jake had always possessed a practical, rational mind that resisted superstitious explanations, but the convergence of these two tragedies seemed to speak of something larger than random cruelty. Perhaps Wise Eagle would have called it the work of spirits seeking justice. Perhaps his mother would have seen the hand of divine providence. Jake only knew that he felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a mantle he could not refuse. He studied the abandoned campsite more carefully, reading the signs that Brennan and his men had left behind. They were sloppy in their confidence, leaving clear tracks and obvious evidence of their direction. From the condition of the fire remains and the freshness of the horse droppings, Jake estimated they had perhaps a day's head start, close enough that a determined pursuit might overtake them within 2 or 3 days of hard riding. But as he prepared to mount Thunder and begin the chase, Jake found himself hesitating. The rage that had sustained him through his pursuit of Brennan after the war had been a consuming fire that had nearly destroyed him before military discipline forced him to abandon it. Now faced with the opportunity to finally balance those old scales, he wondered if he possessed the emotional strength to survive another encounter with the man who had taken everything from him. Shadow seemed to sense his internal struggle and moved to stand directly in front of him, blocking his path to Thunder with deliberate intention. The young wolf's amber eyes held a depth of understanding that was almost human in its complexity, and Jake found himself remembering wise eagle's words about Shadow carrying the spirits of his murdered pack. "You're right," Jake said, reaching down to stroke Shadow's head with gentle fingers. "This isn't about the past anymore. It's about making sure he can't do this to anyone else, human or animal." The realization brought with it a strange sense of peace. For over a decade, Jake had carried the burden of his failure to protect Sarah and Thomas, the crushing guilt of a man who had not been present when his family needed him most. But Shadow's presence had given him a chance at redemption, not by avenging the dead, but by preventing future tragedies. He tucked Brennan's knife carefully into his saddlebag, not as a trophy, but as evidence of the man's nature. When the time came for confrontation, Jake wanted Brennan to understand that his crimes had finally caught up with him, that the families he had destroyed were not forgotten, and that justice, delayed but not denied, was finally at hand. The medicine bag pulsed gently against his heartbeat as Jake swung into the saddle, and Shadow took his position at Thunder's side with the alert bearing of a wolf preparing for the hunt. But this would be different from the vengeful pursuit of his younger years. This time, Jake Morrison would face his demons not as a broken man seeking to fill the void in his soul with blood, but as a protector guided by love for the innocent creature who had taught him that healing was still possible, even for hearts that had been shattered beyond all recognition. The trail stretched ahead through country that grew more rugged and unforgiving with each mile. But Jake no longer felt alone as he followed it. Shadow's presence reminded him that some bonds transcended species and circumstance, that love could bloom even in the darkest soil of tragedy, and that sometimes the most profound courage came not from the willingness to kill one's enemies, but from the determination to prevent them from creating more victims. Brennan's reckoning was coming, but it would be justice, not revenge, that delivered it. The tracks led northeast through increasingly treacherous terrain, following game. Trails that wound between towering rock formations and across streams that ran swift and cold with mountain snowmelt. Jake found himself falling back on skills he had hoped never to use again. The careful art of tracking human prey, reading not just the obvious signs of passage, but the subtle indicators of mood, caution, and intention that experienced hunters left behind like psychological fingerprints. Brennan's party was moving with the careless confidence of men who believed themselves beyond consequences. Their horses' hoofprints showed no attempt at concealment. Their campsites were left without effort to disguise their numbers or direction, and the casual way they had discarded refuse spoke of people who felt no need to hide their presence from potential pursuit. It was the arrogance of predators who had operated too long without challenge, and Jake found it both encouraging and deeply troubling. Shadow had grown increasingly alert as they followed the trail, his behavior shifting from the relaxed companionship of recent days to the focused intensity of a wolf on the hunt. The young animal seemed to understand that their pursuit had taken on deadly serious purpose, and he moved with a fluid grace that reminded Jake of the professional soldiers he had once commanded. Warriors who could switch from casual conversation to lethal precision in the space of a heartbeat. On the second day of tracking, Jake made the decision to examine his military medal, which had been wrapped in oiled cloth and buried at the bottom of his saddlebags for over 8 years. The Congressional Medal of Honor felt heavier than he remembered as he turned it over in his hands. The bronze eagle and ribbon faded, but still recognizable. He had received it for actions during the Battle of Stones River, when he had led a desperate charge to break a Confederate position that was slaughtering his company. The irony was not lost on him that the same government had honored him for killing men in service to the Union cause, while now he found himself preparing to face a man whose crimes transcended any political affiliation. Brennan had used the war as cover for his own sadistic nature, terrorizing civilians under the pretense of military necessity. The medal in Jake's hands represented the moral distinction between necessary violence and savage brutality, a distinction that would soon be tested in the most personal way possible. "I never wanted to be a killer again," Jake said to Shadow as they made camp beside a small mountain lake. The young wolf had grown comfortable with these one-sided conversations, responding with subtle changes in expression and posture that suggested he understood far more than seemed possible. But some men forfeit their right to mercy through the choices they make. Thunder grazed peacefully in the meadow beside the lake, his presence a reassuring constant in Jake's increasingly complicated emotional landscape. The horse had carried him through war and wandering, had been his companion through years of self-imposed exile, and now seemed to sense that their long period of drifting was approaching some kind of resolution. The gelding's calm acceptance of their circumstances helped steady Jake's nerves as he prepared for what might well be his final confrontation with the demons of his past. Jake spent the evening cleaning his Winchester with the methodical care of a professional soldier preparing for battle. The rifle had been his companion since Gettysburg, had saved his life on numerous occasions, and had taken the lives of men who would have gladly killed him given the opportunity. As he worked, he found himself remembering the weight of command, the terrible responsibility of making decisions that would determine who lived and who died in the chaos of combat. But this was different from war. In battle, men faced each other as representatives of opposing causes, and death came as the inevitable consequence of irreconcilable political differences. What awaited him in the mountains ahead was more personal and more absolute, a reckoning between a protector and a predator, between justice and cruelty, between the man Jake had become and the monster Brennan had always been. Shadow's behavior had grown increasingly protective as they drew closer to their quarry. The young wolf now slept within arm's reach of Jake's bedroll, positioning himself between his human companion and any potential approach from the direction of Brennan's trail. During the day, Shadow ranged ahead to scout their route, returning regularly to report with soft vocalizations and body language that Jake was learning to interpret with growing accuracy. The bond between them had evolved beyond simple companionship into something that approached the intuitive communication Jake had once shared with his most trusted soldiers. Shadow could sense Jake's emotional state and respond accordingly, offering comfort when grief threatened to overwhelm him, alerting him to potential dangers before his human senses detected them, and maintaining a steady presence that helped anchor Jake's increasingly turbulent thoughts. On the morning of the third day, Shadow's behavior changed dramatically. The young wolf's hackles rose, his ears pinned forward, and his entire body tensed with the kind of focused aggression Jake had never seen from him before. They were close enough that Shadow could detect scents or sounds that meant something to his lupine senses, even if Jake couldn't interpret them. Jake dismounted and examined the ground more carefully, noting that the tracks were fresher. Here, probably no more than 6 or 8 hours old. Brennan's party had camped nearby recently enough that the ashes from their fire were still warm when Jake tested them with his fingers. More disturbing were the scattered bones and blood stains. That indicated they had killed and butchered several more wolves since leaving the canyon where Shadow's family had died. "They're not just hunting for profit," Jake realized with a cold certainty that made his stomach turn. They're enjoying this. The killing itself has become their purpose. The medicine bag pressed warm against his chest as Jake remounted Thunder and continued following the increasingly fresh trail. Wise Eagle's words about balance and healing seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the evidence of Brennan's escalating cruelty. But the old Lakota's wisdom had not been about avoiding violence entirely. It had been about ensuring that violence served justice rather than revenge, that necessary action emerged from love rather than hatred. Jake found himself thinking about Thomas as they rode, remembering his son's innocent fascination with the wildlife around their Tennessee farm. The boy had possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that reminded Jake strongly of Shadow's responses to human emotion and intention. Thomas would have loved the young wolf, would have delighted in teaching him tricks and games, would have seen in Shadow's loyalty and intelligence the same qualities that made dogs such treasured companions. The thought of his son's joy in such a friendship strengthened Jake's resolve in ways that mere anger never could. This confrontation was not about settling old scores or healing ancient wounds. It was about preventing future Thomas Morrisons from losing their families to men like Colt Brennan, about ensuring that future Shadows would not have to watch their parents die for the entertainment of human monsters. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the mountain slopes, Shadow suddenly froze and pointed toward a narrow valley that opened to their left. His nose worked the air with frantic intensity, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, not the playful sound Jake had learned to associate with games or requests for attention, but the dangerous warning of a predator preparing to defend something. Oh, precious! Jake could smell the smoke now, could hear the faint sound of men's voices carried on the mountain wind. Brennan's camp lay just ahead, probably no more than half a mile down the valley. The moment Jake had been preparing for since discovering his family's bodies over a decade ago was finally at hand. He dismounted and secured Thunder in a grove of aspens, where the horse would be safe but accessible if escape became necessary. Shadow pressed close against his leg, every muscle in the young wolf's body coiled with anticipation. Jake knelt and placed both hands on Shadow's head, looking deep into those amber eyes that held so much intelligence and loyalty. "Whatever happens." "Down there," Jake said quietly, "you remember that you're not alone anymore. We found each other for a reason, and that reason is about to be tested." The Congressional Medal of Honor felt like a talisman against his chest as Jake checked his rifle one final time and began the careful descent toward Brennan's camp. Behind him, Shadow followed with the silent grace of his wild heritage, ready to face whatever dangers awaited them in the valley below. The long trail of grief and wandering that had defined Jake's life since the war was about to reach its destination, and he found himself strangely at peace with whatever resolution the next few hours might bring. Jake could see the camp clearly from his position behind a fallen pine log, 50 yards up the slope. 4 men sat around a fire in the center of a small clearing, their horses picketed nearby and their rifles stacked with the casual confidence of men who feared no pursuit. The 5th member of their party was nowhere visible, but Jake caught movement in the trees on the far side of the clearing that suggested a sentry posted to watch their back trail. Colt Brennan sat with his back to a large boulder, exactly as Jake remembered him, tall and lean, with pale hair that had gone grey at the temples and the same cold eyes that had haunted Jake's nightmares for over a decade. He was older now, his face more lined and weathered, but his bearing still carried the arrogant confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Around his neck hung a necklace made from wolf teeth, trophies from recent kills that glinted white against his dark shirt. The sight of those teeth filled Jake with a rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. But pressed against his own chest, hidden beneath his shirt, was the necklace he had made from the teeth of Shadow's father. Not a trophy of conquest, but a memorial to innocence destroyed. The contrast between Brennan's crude display of dominance and Jake's quiet tribute to the fallen crystallized everything he had come to understand about the difference between violence and justice. Shadow crouched beside him, every line of the young wolf's body screaming readiness for action. Jake could feel the animal's tension through their physical contact, could sense Shadow's recognition of the scents and sounds that connected this place to the massacre of his family. The young wolf's lips were pulled back in a silent snarl, and his amber eyes were fixed on Brennan with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Jake made his decision with the cold calculation of a professional soldier assessing tactical options. The sentry was the immediate threat, positioned to alert the camp of any approach from behind. The other 4 men were relaxed but armed, their weapons within easy reach, but not immediately ready for action. If Jake moved quickly and decisively, he could neutralize the advantage of numbers before Brennan's men fully understood what was happening. He placed a gentle hand on Shadow's head, trying to communicate through touch that the young wolf should wait for his signal. Shadow's eyes met his for a moment, and Jake saw in them the same fierce intelligence that had marked their entire relationship. The wolf understood that they were going into battle together, and his body language spoke of absolute trust in Jake's leadership. Jake rose from behind the log and stepped into the clearing with his Winchester held ready, but not directly threatening. The 4 men around the fire looked up with varying degrees of surprise and wariness, but only Brennan's expression showed true recognition. The pale-haired man's eyes widened slightly, and a slow smile spread across his features, the same cruel expression Jake remembered from that terrible night in Tennessee. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan drawled, his voice carrying the same casual malice that had terrified Sarah and Thomas in their final moments. "Jake Morrison, isn't it? I wondered if you might turn up eventually. You always were a persistent bastard." "Colt Brennan," Jake replied, his voice steady, despite the emotions churning in his chest. "You've got some debts to pay, to my family, and 2 others you've wronged since." Brennan's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Your family? That was war, Morrison. Casualties happen in war, although I'll admit your wife put up more fight than most before I introduced her to my knife." The words hit Jake like physical blows, but he forced himself to maintain composure. Beside him, Shadow had emerged from the tree line and stood with his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat that made Brennan's men shift nervously. "This isn't about war," Jake said. "This is about you murdering innocents for pleasure. The wolves you slaughtered in the canyon, the families you destroyed. It ends here." Brennan's eyes flicked to Shadow, and his smile widened as understanding dawned. "Ah, I see. You've made friends with one of our little orphans. How touching. Tell me, Morrison, does he cry for his mama at night like your boy did?" The crude mockery of Thomas's final moments nearly broke Jake's control, but Shadow's presence beside him served as an anchor to his better nature. The young wolf had faced the loss of his entire family with dignity and courage, and Jake drew strength from that example. "Stand up and face justice like a man," Jake commanded, his rifle now pointed directly at Brennan's chest. "Your men can ride away if they choose. This is between you and me." Brennan rose slowly, his hand moving with practiced casualness toward the knife at his belt, the same blade that had killed Sarah and Thomas. Around the fire, his companions were reaching for their own weapons, but their movements were hampered by uncertainty about Jake's intentions and capabilities. Shadow chose that moment to step forward, placing himself directly between Jake and the armed men. The young wolf's courage in facing 4 armed humans, despite being outnumbered, was breathtaking in its purity, and Jake felt his heart swell with fierce pride in his unlikely companion. "Brave little fellow," Brennan observed with mock admiration. "Too bad he'll die just like his parents did, slowly and in pain." The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Brennan's men went for their weapons as Jake's Winchester cracked once, twice, dropping the 2 closest threats before they could clear their holsters. Shadow launched himself at the third man with a snarl that seemed to contain all the rage of his murdered pack, his teeth finding the hunter's gun arm and sending the rifle spinning away into the darkness. Brennan himself rolled behind the boulder. He had been sitting against, his own rifle appearing in his hands with the fluid motion of long practice. The clearing filled with gunsmoke and shouts as Jake dove for cover behind a fallen tree, bullets splintering the bark inches from his head. The hidden sentry had revealed himself now, his muzzle flashes winking from the tree line as he tried to get a clear shot at Jake's position. Shadow fought with the savage grace of his wild heritage, but Jake could see the young wolf was overmatched by the remaining gunman. A rifle butt caught Shadow across the ribs, sending him tumbling with a yelp of pain that cut through Jake's heart like a blade. The sight of his companion being hurt unleashed something primal in Jake, not the cold, tactical thinking of a soldier, but the protective fury of a father defending his child. Jake rose from cover with his rifle blazing, working the lever action with mechanical precision as he advanced across the clearing. The sentry's shot went wide as Jake's bullet found its mark, and the man toppled from his position in the trees with a crash that seemed to echo across the entire mountain valley. The hunter Shadow had been fighting tried to bring a pistol to bear, but Jake's next shot ended that threat before it could fully develop. Suddenly, the clearing was silent except for the sound of Jake's own breathing and Shadow's labored panting. From where the young wolf lay against the base of a pine tree, Brennan emerged from behind his boulder, his hands empty but his eyes filled with the same cold calculation Jake remembered from their first encounter. "Just you and me now, Morrison," Brennan said, his voice carrying the same mocking tone that had haunted Jake's memories. "Like it should have been from the beginning." Jake kept his rifle trained on Brennan but didn't immediately fire. Something in the man's posture suggested he was planning one final gambit, and Jake's combat instincts warned him to stay alert despite his apparent advantage. "You could have walked away after the war," Jake said. "Could have found some honest work, made a decent life. Instead, you chose to keep killing innocents." Brennan's laugh was bitter. "Innocents? Your wife wasn't so innocent when she was begging me not to hurt your precious boy. Neither were those wolves when they tried to protect their cubs. The strong take from the weak, Morrison. That's the only law that matters in country like this." As he spoke, Brennan's hand was inching toward the distinctive knife at his belt, the blade that had ended so many lives, human and animal alike. Jake saw the movement but waited, understanding with sudden clarity that this confrontation needed to end, not with a rifle shot, but with a more personal justice. Brennan's knife cleared its sheath in a silver arc, aimed at Jake's throat, but the former cavalry officer had been expecting the attack. Jake sidestepped the blade and brought the stock of his Winchester around in a devastating blow that caught Brennan across the jaw and sent him sprawling. The knife flew from nerveless fingers to land point first in the soft earth. Jake stood over his fallen enemy with the rifle pointed at Brennan's chest, and for a moment the temptation to end it all with one final shot was almost overwhelming. This man had destroyed everything Jake had ever loved, had murdered Shadow's entire family for profit and entertainment, had spread suffering and terror across countless miles of frontier territory. But Shadow's labored breathing reminded Jake of why he was really here. This wasn't about revenge for past wrongs. It was about protecting future innocence from this monster's depredations. Justice didn't require Jake to become a killer in cold blood, no matter how richly Brennan deserved death. Instead, Jake reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a branding iron he had taken from an abandoned ranch weeks earlier. The metal was cold now, but it would serve its purpose without the need for fire. He pressed the iron against Brennan's forehead with enough force to leave a permanent scar, not the mark of ownership, but the mark of justice finally served. "Every person you meet for the rest of your life will know what you are," Jake said quietly. "The brand will tell them you're marked as a killer of innocence. You'll never again find refuge among decent people." Brennan's eyes were filled with a fear Jake had never seen there before. Not fear of death, but fear of exposure, of being known for what he truly was. Jake gathered the weapons scattered around the clearing and threw them down a nearby ravine, leaving Brennan alive but defenseless in the wilderness. As Jake knelt beside Shadow to assess his injuries, he felt the weight of completed justice settling over him like a warm blanket. The young wolf's ribs were bruised but not broken, and his breathing was already becoming easier. Shadow's amber eyes met Jake's with perfect trust, and in them Jake saw not the ending of a long pursuit, but the beginning of something infinitely more precious. Spring came early to the valley Jake had chosen for their new home, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that seemed to heal both land and spirit after the harsh trials of winter. He had found the place quite by accident 3 months after the confrontation with Brennan, following a tributary of the Powder River into a hidden meadow surrounded by protective ridges and blessed with clear water and rich grassland that would support both crops and livestock. Shadow had recovered completely from his injuries, though he still carried himself with a slight favor of his left side when the weather turned cold. The young wolf had grown magnificent over the winter months, his coat thick and lustrous, his bearing confident and alert. But for all his wild beauty, he had chosen to remain with Jake, treating the modest cabin they had built together as his territory to defend and Jake as his pack leader to follow. The cabin itself was simple but solid, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace that provided warmth during the mountain winters and a covered porch where Jake could sit in the evenings and watch. The sun set over the western peaks. He had built it with his own hands, using skills learned from his father and refined during his years of wandering, taking satisfaction in creating something permanent after so many years of temporary camps and borrowed shelter. Thunder grazed contentedly in the meadow beside the cabin, grown fat and sleek on the abundant grass. The old horse seemed to understand that their wandering days were finally over, that this peaceful valley represented the end of a journey that had lasted far longer than either of them had expected when they first rode away from civilization. All those years ago, Jake had established routines that brought structure and purpose to his days. Each morning, he would tend to the small garden he had planted behind the cabin, growing vegetables that reminded him of the farm in Tennessee, while Shadow patrolled the perimeter with the serious dedication of a sentry on guard duty. In the afternoons, Jake would work on improving their homestead, building fences, clearing deadfall from the meadow, or crafting furniture from the abundant timber that surrounded their valley. But it was the evenings that Jake treasured most, when he would sit on the porch with his whittling knife and a piece of pine or aspen wood, slowly coaxing shapes from the grain, while Shadow lay at his feet like a great dog. Jake had discovered an unexpected talent for carving, and his small collection of wooden animals, bears, elk, eagles, and rabbits, decorated the cabin's mantelpiece like a 3-dimensional celebration of the wildlife that shared their mountain refuge. The wooden wolf figurine he had been working on for weeks was nearly complete, its features refined to capture something essential about Shadow's character: the intelligence in the eyes, the alert set of the ears, the powerful grace of the body. It would be Jake's masterpiece, a permanent tribute to the unlikely bond that had saved them both from the isolation and bitterness that had threatened to consume their souls. Word of their presence had spread gradually among the scattered ranchers and trappers who worked the territory, and Jake found himself becoming an unofficial guardian of the region's wildlife. Men would ride up to the cabin, seeking his advice about predators threatening their livestock, or asking him to mediate disputes about grazing rights and water access. His reputation as someone who understood both animals and men had earned him a respect he had never sought but found deeply satisfying. Shadow's presence served as a living reminder of the need to balance human interests with the rights of wild creatures. The wolf's obvious contentment in Jake's company demonstrated that coexistence was possible between species that others considered natural enemies. Ranchers who had initially been suspicious of Jake's unusual companion gradually came to see Shadow as evidence of Jake's unique qualifications to help them solve problems that required understanding rather than violence. On quiet evenings, Jake would take out his journal and write about the lessons he had learned during his years of wandering, and the insights that continued to emerge from his relationship with Shadow. The pages filled with observations about animal behavior, sketches of the changing seasons in their valley, and reflections on the healing power of simple daily routines shared with someone who asked nothing more than loyalty and affection. He had also resumed his correspondence with the outside world, writing letters to former army comrades and distant relatives who had wondered what had become of the man who had simply vanished into the territories after the war. His letters spoke of peace found and purpose rediscovered, of a life rebuilt around the most fundamental values of protection and care. As summer deepened into autumn and the aspen leaves turned gold against the blue mountain sky, Jake completed the wooden wolf figurine and placed it in the position of honor on the mantelpiece. Shadow seemed to understand the significance of the carving, studying it with the same serious attention he brought to everything that mattered to Jake. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jake said as they sat together on the porch watching. The first stars appear in the darkening sky. Shadow's tail thumped once against the wooden planks, and he pressed closer to Jake's side with the contentment of a creature who had found exactly where he belonged. Jake thought about the broken man, who had wandered these mountains just 1 year earlier, carrying nothing but grief and bitter memories. That man could never have imagined the peace that filled this valley, the satisfaction of work done with purpose, the deep joy of caring for another living being who returned that care with absolute devotion. In the distance, a lone wolf's howl drifted across the mountains, not Shadow, but one of his wild cousins singing to the moon. Shadow lifted his head to listen, but made no move to answer the call. He had found his pack in this quiet valley, and his place was here, beside the man who had taught him that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that family could be built from the most unlikely materials when hearts were finally ready to open again.